So I want to start with a question for Senator Dorgan, since you're fresh out of politics. Obviously, voters' perceptions of the economy are widely believed to be the most influential factor in this year's elections. But obviously, energy prices and energy policy can influence the economy. So I'm just wondering, what role do you see energy issues, energy prices, energy policy playing in this election?
Well, I think it'll play some role, but a lot depends always on the price of gasoline. There's nothing that quite galvanizes the American mind like a $4 or $4.50 or $5 a gallon gasoline projected. And I do think also it's probably going to play less a role than some think. I'm talking about energy now, because the political system has great difficulty assimilating good news. This is an unbelievable good news story. It's almost the black swan theory of the impact of the highly improbable. No one in this room 7 or 10 years ago would have predicted what has happened today. We didn't know. We couldn't even see it on the frequency charts of what might be possible. So this is awfully good news in a lot of areas on energy. And again, you know, the old saying, bad news travels halfway around the world before good news gets its shoes on. Well, this is really good news. And largely, it is the negatives that drive the political system. So it may play less of a role than one would think, but it's very important for the American people to understand where we are in energy, what this contributes to our both energy security and our national security.
Jim, what do you think? How are energy issues going to play in this election?
Well, I'll make the top line comment, which is I'm actually amazed that, at least so far, this is the first election in a long time where energy is in the top 5 list. Now, not surprisingly, because of its immediate connection to jobs and economic growth. And so, in the past, when jobs and economic growth weren't at the forefront, maybe we weren't thinking about energy so much. But I really am amazed. In both the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign, they're spending a lot of time talking about energy and visions of energy. I do share Senator Dorgan's view that there's incredible, it's just immensely a good news story. God bless America. Just when we're up against the wall, we have this incredibly inexpensive new resource that's leading to technology advancement that's allowing this just remarkable new capacity to also develop oil and other very high value liquids and products that come from that America's really good at, and also that really good high quality jobs come from it. And so getting our head around that and not screwing it up, I think, becomes a centerpiece of how we go forward. And on the not screwed up factor, I just want to make one observation. A story of the shale boom, an important one, is it's booming because it's largely on private land or on state land, not because it's on federal land. And so we have just a stark picture that we've been lacking for some time to show you just how fast the private sector and state-based activities can move when they are not constrained from moving. And I think the federal government's had a hard time catching up with that. There's now rethinking of what the federal government do to play its part with our public lands that are actually dedicated to these purposes. But I think this election's about that juxtaposition of government needing to move at the speed of business, as government does its important job of protecting health and safety and environmental and natural resources. But how can government move at that speed so we don't disadvantage ourselves in the global marketplace?
Joe Stanko, you follow what's going on at the EPA and other regulatory agencies. How are events on the campaign trail affecting the speed and substance of what agencies like the EPA are up to?
Well, I think there's a lot of reaction on the campaign trail to recent regulations and the discussion of ongoing regulations at EPA. And I think as a top-line concern, a number of policymakers are looking at and seeing certain actions that are taking us a little bit backwards on energy diversity and backwards on production. Mm-hmm. With regard to some of the recent regulations on coal-fired power plants, I think we're seeing new plants, coal-fired power plants being, for all effective purposes, taken off of the table, and there's some reaction to that. I think the regulations on the Utility Act and the new source performance standards for greenhouse gases are going to result in even more coal plant retirements, and that's going to have an effect on the generating community. Coal's a large part of our current generation fleet. That capacity is not immediately going to be taken up, and the current economic situation, I think, is masking a generation shortage in the U.S. And if we hit a recovery, I think consumers and industry will see that. On the natural gas and the oil shale play side of the house, I agree with what Jim said about a fantastic amount of movement going on private land. I think policymakers are looking, and this will be part of the discussion, that number one, how are we going to get appropriate access to federal lands, and number two, hydraulic fracturing, while largely regulated at the state level, appears to be on the path to some kind of regulation at the federal level. A lot of people have concerns about how that is going to impact the speed and the ability to bring this resource online.
And do you see any sign that the rhetoric on the campaign trail is having any impact on what agencies like the EPA are doing, the substance, the speed, and not just the EPA,
right?
DOE, Interior?
Right. Well, the thing about EPA is I think they've taken a lot of their big ticket rules and marched them out the window, certainly with regard to power plants, and I don't know that there are big ticket rules that are going to be going final between now and the election. One of the miraculous things about election years is at some point, for some reason, big ticket rules don't seem to appear after July or August in a campaign year. But I think folks are going to be certainly talking about the past rules, and also we've got some rules like the new PM 2.5 standards that are scheduled in August. Be interesting to see if those actually roll out, and whether EPA would go final before the election on things like the new source performance standard for greenhouse gases.
Kevin Book, you published a report not long ago in which you talked about how hydrocarbon production matters in some swing states, but only a few, and how voters in the swing states are concerned about high gasoline prices, but perhaps not overly so. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your research found.
Sure. Thanks for the question. The problem with the energy production we've had in the United States to date, and especially currently, is that it's very efficient. About 80% of the GDP thrown off by oil and gas, which is 1% of national GDP as a total, which, by the way, if 1% of your GDP is creating 3% of your new jobs, that's pretty good. That's in 4 states. So a lot of people don't see this. They don't understand. They're not infatuated with the changes or the gains. And so in many of these states that have never historically been, or at least in 110 years, like Pennsylvania, oil-producing states of note, there's suddenly big changes afoot. And in Pennsylvania and Ohio, they matter. But in the other 11 states identified as swing states, most of them are net energy consumers without much leverage or production. They don't really care. And actually, their energy costs have been remarkably close to the national average. Now, the national average is a big deal. Household share of wallet going to energy has gone up by about 2 1/3% over the last decade. That's a big deal. And people do care about energy in this election because of not just the economic opportunity it provides, but the cost implications of what's going to happen. And that maybe takes us to sort of maybe one of the challenges for U.S. energy policy, which is it tends to be very reactive. We have a tendency to think that the present state of affairs is the way it's always going to be. Demand is at a low point, really a dramatic low point, and some of that is compression because people are facing these household costs. Some of that, though, is going to change and come back with economic recovery. We all want that, and we better make sure that we're making the right investments now, countercyclically, because nothing costs more than closing the supply-demand gap in a hurry.
Senator Dorgan, let's look ahead to potentially a second Obama term. What do you think that means for energy policy? What lessons do you think the president and his aides have learned from the past few years about energy, from both their successes and their setbacks?
Well, I think if President Obama gains his second term, I do think the energy policy will be a balanced policy. I think you'll see more activity to open federal areas for drilling. Let me just point out, however, that it's not as if there's been a massive closing of those areas. We're actually producing more now on federal lands than we did the last 3 years of the previous administration. But it is true that the private sector has just galloped along. And I come from a state, North Dakota, where we now have, I think, 206 drilling rigs, drilling 1 well a month. That's 2,400 wells a year. It is an unbelievable success story in North Dakota. We very soon will be the second largest oil producer in America. And you know, let me just, if I have the time to tell you one short story, to tell you what a great success this has been. There was a researcher in England studying the night photographs from the space station 240 miles above the Earth. And when you study the planet at night, you see from the lights where the population centers are, and he found a mystery city. He saw Minneapolis, St. Paul, Sioux Falls, Fargo, Bismarck, and then he saw a mystery city on the western plains of North Dakota. And it was the flaring of natural gas from what I think is becoming the largest oil field in the world. Obviously, they're finding a lot of oil, the best quality oil, and they're at this point still flaring much of the natural gas to create a mystery city for an English researcher. Having said all that, this is a great good news story. I think this administration understands that. I understand that a number of things have happened, the BP issue in the Gulf. I offered the amendment that would have opened up the Eastern Gulf that passed the Energy Committee on a bipartisan vote, but the BP situation changed all of that. But I think we will move along, opening in the right way public lands, federal lands, and I think we're set to have a very robust and encouraging energy future, which not only includes oil and natural gas, but includes other fuels and renewable energy as well.
Mr. Connaughton, how do you see a Romney administration confronting energy issues, and particularly on the issue of climate change? What would a Romney administration, what kind of policies would it support on that issue?
Well, you've got, you know, go to the campaign site, take a look at their information. I think Governor Romney has been very focused on what everyone says, which is we're for an all of the above strategy. But I think the campaigns worked very hard to identify those areas and those bottlenecks that they would go after, to be sure that we have all of the pieces of the energy equation moving. And that ranges everywhere from clean coal to even, you know, rethinking the nuclear energy equation, which is also, I think, important from a diversity perspective and from an energy security perspective. I would observe that it's time to action that's the big issue. So when we talk about a lot more federal public land development in the last 3 years, it's because of the 5 years of work it took before that to make that development possible. And that's a long time before you get the green light to go forward with something that's economically productive, a job creator, and by the way, that complies with all environment and natural resource laws. One of the myths of all of this development is that somehow it's some new area that we now have to look at regulation. Well, as it happens, every project, including the Keystone Pipeline, has to comply 100% with all of our environmental and natural resource laws at the federal, state, and local level. So there's not some magic new environmental issue here. There's a whole suite of regulations that actually these companies spend a lot of money and are actually pretty good at complying with. And so to me, what I think you'll see out of a Romney approach is a much more business-oriented, how do we get the job done in the quickest period of time while hitting all of our performance marks, in terms of getting jobs moving, in terms of getting the energy supply going, in terms of more rational approaches to public lands management, and assuring that these projects continue to meet environmental requirements 100% of the time.
Great. So whoever wins in November is going to have to confront the deficit. That's going to be one of the biggest issues for whoever is the next president. And I'm curious how you all see energy policy being influenced by the imperatives of deficit reduction. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on how that is going to constrain policymakers, what areas it's going to lead them into?
Well, one sure prescription for zero-sum politics is to start pointing to big numbers and making big statements. And part of the problem is that you have about 1.2 trillion out of our budget in tax expenditures, of which about 200 billion are business, and of that, depending on how you count, between 40 and 80 billion can be linked to energy. So it's a big target. And within that, there are some big targets. But if you were to look at those targets in terms of how much energy you get per tax expenditure dollar, you'd find that some of the most maligned sources are actually some of the most productive from a tax and tax policy perspective. I'm not sure that's how the debate's going to look. That hasn't historically been how the debate looks. But deficit reduction means cutting something. And the high flyers and the big numbers are probably the first targets.
And on that point, Senator Dorgan, I'm curious what your perspective is on this, because, I mean, in one sense, you can see how the imperatives of deficit reduction could lead to higher taxes on certain industries, including this one. It could also potentially lead policymakers to open up more acreage so they can generate more royalties. How do you see deficit reduction playing out and energy policy making being influenced?
Well, I think everything in the budget is at some risk because these deficits are very substantial. But I do think when we talk about the good news from an energy policy standpoint, this is also something that is made in America, you know, and what has pulled off the charts for the last 5 years is anybody talking about made in America. This energy is made in America, and I think we'd be pretty unwise to decide that we shouldn't provide assistance and subsidies and incentives in the right way. At the end of this year, the production tax credit for wind, for example, falls off a cliff. It's very important, in my judgment, for us to continue that. And I mean, I really think that we should, I'm for all of the above. We should do everything and do it well, and we should be very careful and thoughtful about what kinds of incentives do we want going forward. But everything in the budget is going to be at risk, and I suspect especially not just at the end of this year, but also next year when there is tax reform on the table, which will be a very substantial effort as well.
Yeah, but just one comment. One of the interesting things about energy is, as opposed to something like healthcare, where you've got a lot of federal capital moving into it, one of the easiest ways to stimulate capital development in the energy area is to have responsible but consistent policies going forward. I mean, in the electricity sector, we're seeing a lot of capital sitting on the sideline because of the uncertainty about how coal-fired power plants are going to be regulated or how coal as a resource or other resources are going to be using. And I think one way, without having it, scored anything with regard to Congress, is for some of these regulatory actions to be done on a little bit better science, analyzing some of these long-term impacts, working with a compliance program that allows folks to meet the environmental standards, yet pull in capital, private capital.
Talk about,
Can I just mention to you that I chair, along with Trent Lott, Senator Lott, a project over at the Bipartisan Policy Center working on energy issues, and we have especially this issue, taking a look at all the incentives that exist. This should not be a case of, ready, fire, aim. Let's really understand what exists out there, how it's being used, to what effect. And so we have a project ongoing. It's a 2-year project. Will be completed in January or February of next year to give to the next president and the next Congress.
Yeah, so let me pick up on that, and let me give 2 points. Let me talk about the tax incentives and that whole setting. Also, for the first time in 25 years, right, or almost 25 years, we're going to have a big debate on comprehensive tax reform. And that creates a very interesting platform post-election, not in the lame duck, to see in the industrial part of America what the appropriate capital formation balance will be between corporate tax rate reduction, and there may be a willingness to forego some of these. Some are direct subsidies, some are tax credits, some are, as Jack was talking about, some are just the regular taxation system applicable to all, which the bipartisan center is looking at. But there's a very interesting potential for a new way of thinking about these capital structures that, in my view, will be important in 2 respects. One is when you're subsidizing every source of energy, to the extent there's being subsidized equally, you're not subsidizing anything, right? It's just you're asking the taxpayer to just bring money back in to change the pricing of the entire system. Now, as it turns out, above that line, there's different preferences, but it's a much smaller wedge of the amount of money that's coming out of the federal fisc. And so I think we're going to have the first opportunity to have a real conversation about that, and then figure out maybe there's a pretty big horse trade. For our part, just to give one example, and we're in the entire energy space, including upstream gas, we've begun to seriously question all of the subsidy structures because we are experiencing just some absurd distortions. We're big in wind, we're big in nuclear, we've got lots of gas, we have coal, but there's some just really absurd distortions that are now happening because we haven't thought through all the consequences of this. And so I think this is a rare moment. But the other side of the equation is the industrial demand side of the equation. If we can get more rational market view, transparent market view on these different energy sources, and if we have a bit of a rational sense to tell the private sector, this is what your rule set's going to look like for the next 5 to 10 years. Then you can see an even more explosive growth in industrial capital investment and demand and jobs and investment in environmental protection. Right now, there's a phrase, money is the coward. And a lot of capital planning is just stuck. Because until you know what the rule is, it's hard to make a commitment because you don't know what your rate of return is going to be. And we're an incredibly competitive nation, and our rate of returns are small. They're not huge like in IT. When you're in the industrial space and the energy space, they're really, really tight margins that you're getting. And that difference of just not knowing where that regulatory arbitrage is the difference between spending money on a new project or not. And because of the uncertainty of this whole set of rules and what they'll require, it's this invisible drag on the economy that nobody talks about very much, but it's invisible and it's big. It's big, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment just waiting to kind of know what's coming. And I think that's the greatest challenge for the new president, whether it's Barack Obama or Mitt Romney.
So what would your company be willing to give up in exchange for regulatory certainty? I mean, you're saying you're looking at subsidies that perhaps should be on the table. Your company at one point sought a loan guarantee from the Department of Energy. Would your company or your industry be willing to support, giving up those as part of a grand deal that would give you regulatory certainty in terms of time it takes to build a new reactor or?
Yeah, and so for us, as we look at the equation, you have the corporate tax rate reform, you have the very important issue of expensing and dividends, which actually keep capital costs low and help people with retirement and pensions. And so there's going to be a lot of weight toward, let's look at that side of the ledger. And then when the pressure comes to say what's on the other side of the ledger, we're going to be very constructive in that conversation. You mentioned loan guarantees for nuclear. That is one of those very focused programs that provides in a competitive electricity market the equivalent of rate-based recovery in a monopoly regulatory environment. And so if you're trying to create a backstop for nuclear, you have to look at that. But again, even that is not working very well, is our experience. It didn't work well in the case of us trying to build a 4,000 union job nuclear power plant. And so it's time to rethink some of this. So
maybe giving those up? Or?
Our view is we like the free market. We like a level playing field, and simplify is probably the best thing we could possibly do at this point, and bring durable certainty is the second best thing we can do at this point. So we're going to be very constructively engaged in that conversation.